Ivan Milat. For years, backpackers vanished along one stretch of Australian highway, and no one knew where they went. The answer was waiting in a forest, in graves no one had thought to look for. Between 1989 and 1992, Ivan Milat abducted and murdered 7 young travelers, 2 men and 5 women, aged 19 to 22, picking them up as they hitchhiked along the Hume Highway southwest of Sydney. Among them were 3 German, 2 British, and 2 Australian backpackers, including Joanne Walters, 22, and Caroline Clark, 21. He took them into the Belanglo State Forest near Berrima, a place so remote it would keep its secrets for years, and there he killed them. The bodies were left in shallow graves beneath the trees, hidden so well that some lay undisturbed for years. Milat was one of 14 children, raised in Guildford, New South Wales, and had been in trouble with the law from his teens, with a long fascination for guns and hunting. To the young travelers who met him on the road, he could seem like just an ordinary man offering a lift. That ordinariness was part of what allowed him to operate for so long. How many travelers had climbed into his car and never been seen again before anyone understood a pattern was forming? The forest began giving up its dead in 1992, when 2 bushwalkers stumbled on the first set of remains while wandering off the track. Over the months that followed, more graves were uncovered, and police realized they were dealing with a single killer who had used the same ground again and again. But they had no name. The breakthrough came not from the forest, but from a survivor. A British backpacker named Paul Onions had escaped Milat in 1990, fleeing a man who had pulled a gun on him along the highway and managing to flag down help before he could be taken. In 1994, after reading about the murders, Onions contacted Australian police, and his account pointed them toward Milat. When officers arrested Milat at his Eagle Vale home in May of 1994 and searched the property, they found what they needed. Weapons linked to the killings were recovered, along with camping gear, clothing, and belongings that had once been carried by the people he had murdered. Trophies kept from the dead and stored in his own home. The evidence tied him to the forest and to the highway, with a weight that no story could explain away. In July of 1996, Milat was convicted of 7 murders and the attack on Onions. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, 1 for each life he had taken, plus a further 18 years for the attack on the man who survived. He never confessed to a single killing. To the end, he denied everything, refusing to give the families of his victims even the small mercy of the truth. Who were the others police always suspected he had killed, the cases that could never quite be proven? So who was the man behind the murders? Milat had been in trouble with the law since his teens and carried a lifelong fascination with guns and hunting. Yet to most people he presented as a hard-working laborer, one of a large family, unremarkable to neighbors and workmates. Beneath that surface was a predator who treated a stretch of highway as a hunting ground and a forest as a graveyard, choosing strangers far from home who would not be missed quickly. The trophies he kept suggested a man who relived what he had done long after the road had gone quiet. Milat died in custody in October of 2019 of cancer after being moved from the high-security Goulburn Supermax, where he had spent his final years, to a Sydney hospital. He was cremated, the cost drawn from his prison account after the state declined to pay for his funeral. He took his final secrets with him, and the full count of his crimes may never be known. Investigators long believed he had not acted entirely alone, and that other victims of his may still lie undiscovered in the bush. For the families who buried children who had set out to see the world, the forest remains the place where those journeys ended. The next case moved to South Australia, and a series of killings that stayed hidden for years inside a disused bank. John Bunting and Robert Wagner. In a quiet country town, police opened a disused bank vault and found a row of barrels. What was inside would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the country's criminal history, and give the case a name that still unsettles decades later. Between 1992 and 1999, in the struggling northern suburbs of Adelaide, a group led by John Bunting murdered 12 people. Bunting, born in the mid-1960s, was the manipulative center of it. With Robert Wagner, several years younger, as his closest follower, their victims were vulnerable people drawn from the edges of their own circle, acquaintances and associates whom Bunting branded as worthless or as wrongdoers in order to justify what he did to them. Over the years, the killings grew steadily more cruel, and the bodies were hidden rather than buried in any ordinary sense. 8 of the victims were eventually found inside barrels stored in the vault of a closed bank in the town of Snowtown, roughly 140 kilometers north of Adelaide. Others were recovered from earlier burial sites elsewhere in the region. The town itself gave the case its lasting name, though neither the victims nor the killers came from there. It was simply the place the remains were kept. How had so many people disappeared over so many years without anyone connecting the losses? The answer was that the victims were chosen precisely because they could vanish without an outcry. In some cases, the killers continued to draw the victims' welfare payments and even mimicked their voices on the phone, keeping the disappearances quiet for months or years at a time. The thread that finally unraveled it was the disappearance of a woman named Elizabeth Hayden. Police inquiries into her fate led them, in May of 1999, to a former bank in Snowtown, where they opened the vault and found 8 bodies packed into 6 barrels. 4 men were arrested in connection with the case. In 2003, John Bunting was convicted of 11 murders and Robert Wagner of 10, and both were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The judge described them as being in the business of killing for pleasure. A third man, James Vlasakis, pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders, while a fourth, Mark Hayden, was convicted over his role in helping to conceal the bodies and received a lengthy sentence of his own. The case stood as the worst series of killings the state had ever uncovered, and the image of the barrels in the vault became one of the most infamous in the country's criminal history. Who was John Bunting? He was a man who cast himself as a kind of vigilante, claiming he was ridding the world of people he judged unworthy, while in truth he was a manipulator who drew weaker people into his orbit and bound them to him through fear and shared guilt. Wagner became his most devoted accomplice, carrying out his wishes and standing beside him through nearly the entire span of the killings. The horror of the case lay not only in the number of victims, but in the calculated control Bunting held over everyone around him, turning followers into accomplices and victims into people no one would think to look for until it was far too late. Decades on, the case returned to the headlines through a battle over parole. Mark Hayden was released in 2024 after serving his term, freed into the community under strict supervision after authorities pointed to his conduct in prison. Then, in 2025, James Vlasakis was granted parole, which would have made him the first Australian serial killer released on parole. Before the decision was blocked on review over concerns for community safety and sent to the appeal courts, where it remains contested. He stayed in custody, eligible to apply again each year. Bunting and Wagner, however, will never face a parole board. At a hearing in 2025, a judge refused Wagner any prospect of release, describing the murders as the worst crimes ever detected in the state. Both men had been told, in the plainest terms, that they would die in prison, with no date of release to count toward. Both remain behind bars for the rest of their lives. The next case unfolded in a single afternoon, in one of the worst mass killings the country had ever seen. Martin Bryant. On an autumn afternoon at a historic tourist site, an ordinary autumn day turned into the deadliest act of violence in the nation's modern history. On the 28th of April, 1996, Martin Bryant killed 35 people and wounded many more at the Port Arthur Historic Site in Tasmania. He began that morning at a guest house near the site, where he killed a couple he blamed for a grievance involving his father and a property deal that had fallen through. He then drove to the historic grounds and opened fire on visitors and staff in and around a busy cafe and gift shop, and then on people in the car park and along the road, using semi-automatic rifles he had no lawful reason to own. In a matter of minutes, families on a day out at one of the state's most popular historic sites became victims of a massacre that would scar the entire country and change its laws forever. Bryant had been a troubled and isolated figure from childhood, struggling to connect with others, bullied and assessed as having a significant intellectual impairment that left him with the comprehension of a much younger person. He had come into money some years earlier, inheriting a fortune from an older woman he had cared for and later from his father, which left him with money but without the structure of work and no closer to the world around him. He had spent years drifting, increasingly alone. None of it explained what he did. The scale of the loss was so vast that the country struggled to comprehend how one person could cause it. How does a nation respond to something on this scale? The answer reshaped Australian life. In the weeks after the massacre, the Prime Minister, John Howard, led a sweeping overhaul of the country's gun laws, introducing a national agreement that restricted semi-automatic and self-loading weapons and funded a mass buyback that removed hundreds of thousands of firearms from circulation. The reforms became one of the most significant legacies of the tragedy, often cited around the world in the decades since as a model of how a country can respond to a mass shooting. Out of one of the darkest days in the country's history came a change that many credit with preventing further mass shootings. Bryant initially gave little explanation, but in the end, he pleaded guilty, sparing the survivors and the bereaved the ordeal of a trial. He was sentenced to 35 life terms, one for each person he killed, along with more than 1,000 additional years for the wounded and other offenses, with no possibility of parole. It was among the heaviest sentences ever imposed in the country, ensuring he would never again be free. He was sent to Risdon Prison in Hobart, where he has remained ever since, one of the most securely held prisoners in the country. Who was the man responsible? Even years later, his motive resisted easy explanation, and a psychiatric assessment that surfaced long afterward offered only a partial window into his mind. He was not driven by politics or ideology, but by a tangle of grievance, isolation, and a mind that those who assessed him found deeply and lastingly troubled. There was no manifesto, no cause, only a deeply troubled young man who had come apart, and a community left to bury its dead. That absence of a clear reason has only added to the horror, leaving survivors to live with a loss that can never be fully understood, and a question without an answer. Today, Bryant remains alive in custody, held in a closed and tightly controlled unit, his health reportedly poor after decades inside, where he is kept apart from the general prison population for his own safety and that of others. He has a history of self-harm during his long imprisonment and lives largely apart from other inmates, a closely managed prisoner with no prospect of ever leaving. For the families of the 35 who died, and for the survivors who carry the day with them, the case is less a story about him than about the people he took and the country that changed in their memory. More than 2 decades on, the site itself stands as a memorial to the dead. The next case reached back to the 1980s, and a crime that shook an entire city. John Travers et al. A young nurse walked home from work one evening and never arrived. The search for her and for the men responsible would grip an entire nation. On the 2nd of February, 1986, a 26-year-old nurse named Anita Cobby was abducted in the western suburbs of Sydney by 5 men traveling in a stolen car. She had finished a shift and was making her way home on foot when they seized her. She was taken to a paddock on the city's outskirts, where she was assaulted and murdered, her body found by a farmer 2 days later. The sheer brutality of the crime committed against a young woman simply making her way home from work, horrified the public in a way few cases ever had, and her name became known across the country. The 5 men were John Travers, who was 18 and acted as the ringleader, Michael Murdoch, also 18, and 3 brothers, Michael, Gary, and Leslie Murphy. They had been out that night looking for a car to steal and a victim to attack when they crossed paths with Cobby, who had the misfortune of walking home alone. There was no connection between them and the woman they killed. She was chosen at random, which made the crime all the more frightening to a city that suddenly felt that no one, on any street, was truly safe. How were they caught? The breakthrough came from within their own circle. A police informant passed on a tip that pointed investigators toward the group. In a now famous piece of police work, Travers was secretly recorded confessing to the killing while speaking to a hidden listener, and he named the others who had been with him. That recording, made without his knowledge, helped seal the case. Travers pleaded guilty, and in 1987, the remaining 4 were convicted at trial after evidence laid out the full horror of what had been done. All 5 were sentenced to life in prison, and in an extraordinary step, their files were marked never to be released, ensuring they would die behind bars. The judge and the public alike regarded the crime as among the most savage the state had seen, and the sentence reflected a determination that these men would never walk free. Anita Cobby's death prompted an outpouring of grief across the country, with enormous crowds attending her funeral and a city demanding that those responsible never be released. So what became of them? The years inside have been harsh. One of the brothers, Michael Murphy, died in custody in 2019 of a long-standing illness, the first of the 5 to die behind bars, none of them ever having been released. Another of the brothers, Gary Murphy, was severely beaten by fellow inmates in 2019, hospitalized in critical condition before being returned to a high-security prison. A sign of the contempt the case still draws, even inside the system. Travers, the ringleader, remains in maximum security, having once tried to break out of a prison van in the years after his conviction, only to be recaptured. The remaining men are also held in high-security facilities, their files still bearing the same marking they were given nearly 40 years ago, never to be released. Who were they? They were young men, some barely adults, with criminal histories between them, who came together in a single night of violence that would define the rest of their lives. The randomness of the crime, the absence of any reason beyond opportunity and cruelty, is what has kept the case in the public memory for decades. It became a turning point in how the country thought about violence against women, and about the safety of something as ordinary as a walk home from work. For the family Anita Cobby left behind, the marking on those files has been the one constant assurance that the men responsible would never be free. Her widower has spoken over the years of waiting for each of them to die in prison, the only resolution the system can offer him. The next case moved to a quiet suburban street, and a family lost in a single night. Robert Sy. A family of 5 went to bed in their suburban home, and by morning, the household had been all but wiped out. The man responsible was someone they trusted. In the early hours of the 18th of July, 2009, 5 members of the Lynn family were killed in their home in North Epping, a suburb of Sydney. Among the dead were Min Lin, 45, known as Norman, his wife Lily, 43, her sister Irene, 39, and the couple's 2 young sons. A teenage daughter survived only because she was away on a school trip overseas at the time, returning home to find her parents, her aunt, and her brothers gone. An entire family, gathered under one roof in a quiet suburban street, was gone in a matter of minutes, in a crime of staggering brutality. Suspicion eventually turned to a member of the family itself. Robert C., a former ear, nose, and throat doctor who had migrated from China a few years earlier, was married to the sister of one of the victims, which placed him squarely inside the family's circle of trust. Prosecutors argued that the killings had grown out of resentment and wounded pride within the family, a private bitterness over standing and money within the family that, the prosecution said, had curdled over time into something monstrous. How could someone seated at family gatherings have carried out such a thing against the people closest to him? It was that closeness, the idea of a killer welcomed at the family table, that made the case so chilling to the public. The investigation was long and difficult. Z was arrested in 2011, and covert surveillance later captured him destroying a small box that police believed was connected to the case. It was the kind of detail that pointed toward guilt without proving it outright, and the case would turn on a great many such details. But the path to a verdict was anything but smooth. The case dragged on for years and went through several aborted trials and a hung jury before it finally reached a conclusion, a sign of just how circumstantial and fiercely contested the evidence was. It was not until a fourth trial, in early 2017, more than 7 years after the killings, that a jury found Z guilty. And even then, only by a majority verdict rather than a unanimous one. Weeks later, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, one for each life taken from the family in that single night. The judge described the murders as heinous in the extreme, an attack that had wiped out almost an entire family as they slept in their beds. As the sentence was handed down, Z protested his innocence aloud in the courtroom, insisting he had not killed the Lin family, and calling himself an innocent man. An appeal against his conviction was later dismissed by the courts, which upheld the jury's verdict and left the life sentences in place. Yet the case has never fully settled. Z's wife has continued to maintain his innocence, and a campaign disputing the verdict argues that the conviction rested on circumstantial evidence and a divided jury rather than any direct proof. Supporters point to the years of failed trials, the lack of a confession, and the absence of a clear motive as reasons for doubt. For balance, it is worth noting that this dispute remains live, even as the courts have upheld the conviction at every formal stage. Who is Robert Sy, then, in the eyes of the law? He is a man found responsible for erasing almost an entire family in a single night, a crime made all the more chilling by his place of trust within that family. The surviving daughter was left to grow up carrying a loss almost beyond imagining, while the man convicted of causing it continues to insist he played no part. Few cases in the country's recent history have combined such devastation with such an enduring public dispute over whether the right person was convicted. He remains in prison in New South Wales, serving 5 consecutive life sentences with no prospect of release, even as his wife and his supporters continue to fight to clear his name. If you have made it this far and you are following these cases, take a moment to subscribe, because the next ones are among the most haunting of all. The next case turned to a household where the danger came from the person the victim knew most intimately. Catherine Knight. A relationship ended in a country town, and what investigators found afterward was so disturbing, it would set a grim record in Australian law. On the night between the last day of February and the 1st of March, 2000, in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Catherine Knight killed her partner, John Price, who was 44. What she did to his body afterward was so extreme that the court took unusual measures to limit how the details were shared, and the case became known as one of the most disturbing ever heard in the country. Out of respect for those involved, the worst of it is best left undescribed. It is enough to say that it shocked even the most seasoned investigators, who had rarely, if ever, encountered anything like it. The relationship between Knight and Price had been troubled and frightening. In the days before he died, Price had taken out a court order against her and had warned people at his workplace, plainly and repeatedly, that she might one day kill him. He had even spoken openly of his fear that he would not survive her, telling those around him what he believed was coming. When he failed to turn up to work, colleagues grew worried, And it was that concern that led a worried friend to alert police, who entered the home and found what had happened inside. Why had warnings so clearly voiced not been enough to keep him safe? Knight was no stranger to knives. She had spent years working at an abattoir, a slaughterhouse, where she had become skilled with blades as part of her daily work. And she had a long and documented history of violence across her relationships, having threatened and harmed partners before. Those who knew her described a woman capable of sudden, frightening rage. The crime, when it came, drew on the very skills she had used in her working life, which was part of what made it so chilling to the community around her. Aberdeen was a small place, and the killing of one of its own by a familiar face left a wound that did not heal quickly. The case against her was overwhelming, and in 2001, Justice Barry O'Keefe sentenced Knight to life in prison without the possibility of parole, marking her file with the words, "never to be released." In doing so, she became the first woman in Australia ever to receive such a sentence, a milestone that fixed her place in the country's criminal history. She later challenged the sentence on appeal in 2006, but the Court of Criminal Appeal rejected the bid, leaving the original order firmly in place. So who was Catherine Knight? She had grown up in a violent and dysfunctional household in the Hunter Valley, the kind of upbringing that leaves deep marks, and her adult life had been a series of unstable, often violent relationships in which she had reportedly hurt or threatened those close to her before. Yet none of that fully explained the savagery of what she did. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a woman driven by jealousy and rage, who had threatened violence before and finally carried it out against a man who had tried to end things with her and move on with his life. The warnings he had given, it turned out, had been entirely justified and tragically unheeded. Knight remains alive today, held at a women's correctional center in New South Wales, now around 70 years old. Reports from inside describe her as a long-established and even dominant figure among the other inmates, one who has reportedly taken on the role of settling disputes, a fixture of the prison after more than 2 decades behind its walls, where she has settled into the long rhythm of a sentence with no endpoint. She will not be released. The marking on her file ensures that the woman who set a grim legal first will spend the rest of her life exactly where she is, with no date of release to look toward. The next case crossed the country to Perth, and a couple who killed together over a single terrible autumn. David and Catherine Burney. Most killers work alone. This case involved 2 people, a couple bound together so tightly that they hunted as one. Over roughly 5 weeks in the spring of 1986, in the Perth suburb of Willagee, at a house on Moorhouse Street that would give the case its name, David and Catherine Burney abducted and murdered 4 young women. The victims, lured or seized and taken to the couple's home, included Mary Nielsen, who was 22, Noeline Patterson, who was 31, and Denise Brown, who was 21, along with a 4th young woman. Each was lured or forced into the house, assaulted, and killed, their bodies then taken away and hidden in bushland outside the city. In the space of little more than a month, an ordinary-looking couple in a quiet suburb had become one of the most feared names in the state, the subject of a frantic search even before their crimes were fully understood. The pair had known each other since childhood and shared backgrounds marked by hardship, dysfunction, and instability, drifting in and out of each other's lives for years before reuniting for good. Catherine had left a husband and children to return to David in the year before the killings, the bond between them so consuming that she abandoned her own family and followed him into the worst crimes imaginable, becoming a willing partner rather than a bystander. What drives 2 people to feed each other's worst impulses rather than pull each other back? In the Burneys, that question found its darkest answer. The killings might have continued had it not been for a single act of courage. A 5th young woman, taken to the house, managed to escape through a window while the couple were distracted, fleeing into the street to raise the alarm, terrified but alive. the only one of their captives to get away. She went straight to the police, and despite the disbelief that often greets such accounts, her story was taken seriously and led officers directly to the Bernies' door. Without her escape, the full extent of what the pair had done might never have come to light, and others would almost certainly have died. Confronted with the survivor's account and the evidence it produced, the Bernies confessed and led police to the remote places where the bodies had been left. Both confessed in detail, and in 1987 each received 4 life sentences, one for every woman they had killed. The judge made clear that David in particular should never again be free. The case sat alongside the worst the state had ever seen, made all the more disturbing by the fact that it had been carried out by 2 people acting together. What became of them? David Bernie died in prison in 2005, taking his own life in his cell after years inside. The end of a man the court had said should never be released. Catherine Bernie remains alive, held at a women's prison in Western Australia, where she has become the institution's longest-serving inmate. In 2009, the state's Attorney General moved to revoke any prospect of parole, marking her file, like Catherine Knight's, with the order that she never be released. Over the decades, she has reportedly worked quietly within the prison, including in its library, a mundane routine set against the horror of what she was part of. She has spent longer behind bars than almost any other woman in the state. Who were they then? They were 2 damaged people who, alone, might never have crossed the line they crossed together. United, they formed something far more dangerous than either could have been by themselves. A partnership built around control, obsession, and violence. Investigators would later describe a dynamic in which David led and Catherine enabled, each drawing the other deeper in. The survivor who climbed through that window not only saved her own life, but ended theirs as predators, and remains the reason the case was solved at all, and that no further lives were lost. The next case returned to Sydney, and a killer who chose the most defenseless victims of all. John Wayne Glover. He looked like the most harmless man imaginable, a friendly salesman who chatted with elderly women. That was exactly why no one suspected him. Between 1989 and 1990, on Sydney's affluent North Shore, John Wayne Glover murdered 6 elderly women, their ages ranging from 60 to 93, all of them well into later life. He approached them in the street or followed them into their homes, killed them, and took their money and valuables, preying on women who were frail, trusting, and posed no threat to him at all. The killings spread fear through a wealthy, settled part of the city that had always felt safe, where elderly residents suddenly became afraid to walk to the shops, and the press gave him a name that captured the particular cruelty of it. The Granny Killer, a label that fixed the case in the public mind. Glover had been born in England and had emigrated to Australia in the 1950s, settling into an ordinary working life, eventually as a traveling pie salesman who called on shops and homes across the city's north. He was married, sociable, and known to many as an unremarkable, even likable figure. Beneath that surface, though, he carried a long and troubled history with older women, including a fraught relationship with his own mother and mother-in-law, tensions that some later pointed to as part of what drove him. How could a man so easily trusted move through these neighborhoods again and again, leaving such devastation behind him? For a time, the killer's ordinariness was his greatest protection. Witnesses struggled to imagine that the polite, balding, middle-aged man who blended so easily into the streets could be responsible for such savagery. He was the last person anyone suspected. The breakthrough came when Glover himself began to unravel. After an attempt to take his own life, he left behind a note with the chilling implication that he could carry on no longer with what he had been doing. A message that, alongside other evidence, drew investigators toward the truth. He had already come to their attention over an earlier assault. He was placed under police surveillance. What followed was one of the most haunting episodes of the case. While officers sat outside the home of a woman Glover knew, an acquaintance who had let him in, he killed her inside. The surveillance team unaware until it was too late to save her. He was arrested at the scene, and the evidence quickly tied him to the full string of murders that had terrorized the North Shore over the previous year. The friendly salesman, who had moved unnoticed among his victims, was finally exposed as the predator the city had feared for so long. Glover was convicted of all 6 murders and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of life in prison, one for each woman, with no prospect of release. The man who had hidden behind an unthreatening face would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The sentence reflected not only the number of lives he had taken, but the particular cruelty of choosing victims who could never defend themselves. Few cases in the city's history had caused such sustained fear or such relief when it finally ended. So who was he? Glover was a study in how complete ordinariness can mask something monstrous, how a familiar, unremarkable man can move through a community while doing the unthinkable. There were no obvious warning signs to his neighbors, no outward menace, only a familiar, friendly face moving through familiar streets, which is precisely what allowed him to kill again and again. That gap between a harmless appearance and a monstrous reality is what has kept the case so unsettling in the decades since, and made it a fixture of the country's true crime memory. He died in custody in 2005, taking his own life in his maximum security cell, carrying whatever drove him to the end. The next case moved to a country town, and a crime that struck just days before a wedding. Vincent Stanford. A young teacher was days away from her wedding when she crossed paths with a man no one had reason to fear. He worked quietly in the same school. On Easter Sunday, in April of 2015, in the country town of Leeton, New South Wales, Vincent Stanford attacked and killed Stephanie Scott, an English and drama teacher who was 26. She had gone into the school to do some work during the Easter holidays, just 6 days before she was due to marry. Her wedding plans already well underway. Stanford, a cleaner who worked at the same school, attacked her there when she was alone in the building, then went to disturbing lengths to conceal what he had done. A young woman who had been counting down to the happiest day of her life was suddenly gone, and the small, close-knit town of Leeton, along with the whole country, was left in shock. Stanford had drawn little attention before this. He was in his mid-20s, working as a relief cleaner who came and went from the school, and had spent much of his childhood overseas in Europe before returning to Australia a few years earlier and settling in Leeton with his mother and brother. Unlike many such cases, investigators found no troubled or abusive background, no clear history of harm done to him. That might explain what he did. He had simply been there, an unremarkable presence in the building that few would have looked at twice, until the day he became something else entirely. How does a danger like that hide in plain sight? There were, it later emerged, darker currents beneath the surface. Stanford had made disturbing searches and had shown unsettling behavior toward others before the killing, signs that pointed to a fixation and a capacity for violence that no one around him had recognized in time to prevent what happened. When Stephanie failed to return home, alarm spread fast, and a search began that drew in police and the wider community. The investigation moved quickly once it turned toward the school. He was arrested within days, and the evidence against him was strong enough that he ultimately admitted his guilt rather than face a trial. In 2016, Stanford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with an additional term for a further serious offense committed against Stephanie. The judge placed the crime in the worst category of murder, a category reserved for killings of the greatest gravity. In a strange and painful footnote to the case, Stanford's twin brother received a short sentence for helping to dispose of items belonging to the victim after the fact, drawing his own brother into the edges of the crime and adding a strange, sorrowful layer to an already devastating case. Who was Vincent Stanford? That question proved unusually hard to answer. There was no clear history of mistreatment, no obvious trigger, only a quiet, withdrawn man who had carried something hidden and terrible behind an unremarkable face. The absence of an explanation has made the case all the more unsettling, leaving those who knew Stephanie and the community that had embraced her with a loss that came without warning or reason. The contrast between her bright future, her career, her coming marriage, and the blankness of the man who ended it all is part of what makes the case so hard to absorb. Stanford remains alive, serving his life sentence in New South Wales, held apart from other inmates for safety and security. He will not be released. For the family and the fiancé Stephanie left behind, and for the students she taught, the case stands as a reminder of how completely a single act can shatter a life on the edge of its happiest moment. Her name has since been honored in the town and the profession she loved. The final case turned on a question that haunted an entire city. Why was the killer free at all? Adrian Ernest Bailey. A young woman walked home along a busy road one night and never made it. The man who took her should never have been on the street. In the early hours of the 22nd of September, 2012, Adrian Bailey attacked and killed Jill Meagher, a 29-year-old Irish woman who had moved to Australia with her husband and worked for the national broadcaster. As she walked the short distance home through the inner Melbourne suburb of Brunswick after a night out with colleagues, he followed her, seized her in a laneway just off the busy road, assaulted and killed her, then drove her body out of the city and buried it in bushland some 50 kilometers away, where it would be found days later. A walk that should have taken minutes ended in one of the most notorious crimes in the state's recent history. The search for Jill Meagher gripped the country for days, her face appearing on front pages and screens everywhere, as her family and the public hoped for news. Closed-circuit footage captured a man in a blue hooded top, following her in the moments before she disappeared. An image broadcast everywhere, across news bulletins and social media, as the public, gripped by the case, willed her to be found alive. Within days, the footage, phone records, and other evidence led police to Bailey, who was arrested and, once in custody, eventually led officers to the bushland grave where he had buried her. The grief that followed turned into something larger, as tens of thousands of people, around 30,000 by some counts, marched through the streets of Brunswick along the road where she had last been seen, demanding an end to violence against women and answers about how her killer had been free. But the detail that turned public grief into public anger was Bailey's history. He was not a first-time offender. He carried an extensive record of serious sexual offenses stretching back more than 2 decades, including a long series of attacks for which he had been sent to prison years earlier. He was, by any measure, a known and dangerous repeat offender. Most damning of all, he was on parole at the time he killed Jill Meagher. The question that haunted the city was simple and unbearable. How had a man with his record been free to walk the same streets as his victim? In 2013, Bailey pleaded guilty, sparing the family a trial, and was sentenced to life in prison with a long minimum term of decades before he could even be considered for release. The judge described the murder as among the worst the state had ever seen, a crime of terrible cruelty against a defenseless woman. In the years that followed, he was convicted of further serious offenses from his past, which at first lengthened the time he would have to serve before any release could be considered. On appeal, one conviction was set aside, and the minimum term was adjusted, leaving him eligible to apply for parole only deep into the 2050s, by which time he would be an old man. So who was Adrian Bailey? He was a repeat offender whose lengthy record had been laid out before the courts and the parole authorities long before that September night, a man whose freedom became a symbol of a system that had failed to protect the public from someone it already knew to be dangerous. Jill Meagher's death prompted a hard reckoning over how parole and sentencing decisions are made in the state. leading to reviews of the parole system and tighter rules. And her name became permanently attached to calls for reform. He remains in prison in Victoria, serving his life sentence. The question of how he was ever free that night, still echoing through every retelling of the case. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.